Hi, this is Andrea Boyack again, talking now about the market and business economic impacts and the legal responses to that for the COVID-19 shutdown. So we talked about how the shutdown of business, the shuttering of businesses and all the non-essential working being mandated to stop and people staying at home had impacted individual people who are laid off. But of course, you have the same problems happening for businesses, especially for small businesses like restaurants and gyms and salons and things that are depending upon that sort of revenue of people coming customers to their locations. Now, there are some responses by the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security CARES Act. In fact, that act does cover a lot of things besides individuals. Individuals get $560 billion of aid, but there's also $377 billion for small businesses and some $500 billion for big corporations, as well as state and local governments and public health and some other things of that nature. So we're going to just talk a little bit about what's going on in the realm of the market and the business world, and not just in individual households. One of the big issues has to do with commercial leasing, because many of the businesses that are shut down are things that have physical space, as you say in the industry, bricks and sticks, and are dependent on people actually visiting those spaces and spending money in those spaces. That's the source of revenue. When people can't go there, they can't show up at the gym, or they can't go to the dance studio, or go get their hair cut, or go to the restaurant, you have a massive drop or even complete diminishment of the revenue that the property produces, which means that those particular businesses cannot pay their rent and are unable to keep operating per covenants in the lease. Now, rent obligations are covered by a lease provision, and there are provisions for rent abatement in cases of casualty. But casualty in commercial leases is defined with respect to the physical state of the premises itself. So if there had been a fire or a flood or a tornado or something, then there would not be a continuing requirement to pay rent until the business could open up again. But that wouldn't apply to the case of this sort of mandated, government mandated, pandemic inspired closure. There's nothing actually wrong with the physical space itself. And therefore, there's not a lease out for paying rent. Unless you can say that an act of God means an act of the government, really, you can't say that the lease would excuse a rental payment. Although you might be able to use the contract doctrine of sort of an extreme and unforeseen change of circumstances, impracticability, impossibility, to avoid an operating covenant. An operating covenant meaning a promise to stay open certain hours and certain times. It's not going to really relieve you of paying rent. And in a way that makes perfect sense, because the landlord still needs to have that stream of income to pay its property costs that are not going to go away. Maintenance costs, capital costs for financing the property, etc. And unless the landlord's going to get a break on paying its mortgage, it needs to get the rental income as well. So you have this big gap between the money that's coming in, which might be almost nothing, and the money that is expected to come in. It's actually the same issue in common interest communities if people don't pay their assessments. Now, some have suggested that perhaps the way out of this problem is to have that gap funded by insurance companies through business interruption insurance policies. And in some ways, at first glance, that seems like it would make perfect sense. However, business interruption insurance policies define business interruption to not include non-payment of rent unless the non-payment of rent is caused due to physical loss, damage, or destruction of the property. And in that case, they might cover non-payment of rent during the restoration period. Well, again, that is a poor fit to what's going on today. And in fact, there is a possibility insurance companies do offer additional riders that can be purchased that would cover things like disease and pandemics and interrupted by civil authority types of business interruptions, but normally those are excluded. So there's a problem in that the insurance companies exclude coverage for the exact type of business interruption that we're facing right now. So that just leaves the landlord out or the tenant out or both. Some states are actually considering trying to deal with this problem by passing legislation that would require insurers to cover business losses from the shutdowns. This is pending in Ohio, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. I don't know if it will pass, and I don't know how much the insurance industry is going to push back if it does. So businesses are in trouble for rental reasons, for payroll reasons, for a lot of other reasons. They don't have customers, they can't operate, but they still need to pay per their contracts and per their leases. And business interruption insurance might not cover a pandemic. The CARES Act does provide some support for business owners. It allows for different types of loans, economic injury disaster loans up to $2 million, plus an advance of up to $10,000 immediately. Also, the Small Business Administration non-recourse loan forgiveness, up to 2 months for qualified expenses, which can include rental payments. There's the Paycheck Protection Program created by the CARES Act that permits the government to fund payroll for the small business. So the federal government will pay the payroll costs. Basically, that's done through a loan that then would be forgiven as long as the business maintains payroll. That means it doesn't lay people off. And then the CARES Act does provide some tax benefits, which I won't get into the details here, but basically they provide the businesses an expanded ability to use the losses that they're experiencing now to offset income at other times, and to also deduct more interest. Some large corporations and healthcare and agricultural business also need help and are getting help under CARES. There's $500 billion earmarked for loans, loan guarantees, and investments for large corporations that the Treasury Department will be distributing. $58 billion of that is going to the airline industry just to keep them open, because obviously people aren't really flying around the country right now. There are some protections in here designed to make sure that this is all on the up and up. The company has to disclose that they're receiving funds. They may not do a stock buyback for 1 year, continuing until the loan is repaid plus 1 year. Although many of these companies, to be fair, have just done a whole bunch of stock buybacks already. There's a special provision in the bill that bars the Trump family businesses from obtaining these sorts of special loans. And then they have some incentives to keep people on the payroll, but sadly, they do not require people to be kept on the payroll. And in fact, there's been a few cases, most notably the Kennedy Center was there was some money earmarked to bail out the Kennedy Center, which is a performing arts center in Washington, D.C. And the very next day, the Kennedy Center told all of the musicians in the National Symphony Orchestra that they were being laid off and would be rehired again or considered for rehire once the NSO could start performing again. And so they all got laid off as of April 3rd is their last day, actually, and they're not going to have any health insurance. So that's an interesting thing that they didn't specifically require them to keep people employed. There's also $140 billion under the CARES Act that's going to support the U.S. health system, $100 billion to hospitals for their extra costs, I suppose, and then the rest to buy supplies and do training. And the act also increases the farm bailout amount from $30 billion to $50 billion. Obviously, having reliable food streams during this period of trade interruption is incredibly important as well. Let me just mention before we talk about this that there have been some changes in business bankruptcy. In 2019, the Small Business Reorganization Act created a new subchapter 5 of Chapter 11 of Bankruptcy Code that small businesses could use to reorganize. The debt that could be restructured under that subchapter was capped at $2.7 million. The CARES Act increased that cap to $7.5 million, so it makes bankruptcy more accessible and helpful for small businesses who incur a lot of financial setbacks. And also, the CARES Act also authorized payment plan modifications that can help companies that are currently in bankruptcy. Now, the slowdown doesn't just mean people don't show up at the office. It means it's much harder to do deals. Of all different types of trades, conveyances, financings, ventures, all of those things become much more complicated because of the market uncertainty and the uncertainty with the travel and what's going to happen in industries and what's going to happen with people's income and what's going to happen with all kinds of things. So massive uncertainty, which is tremendously value destroying in a market. There's also logistical problems caused by people transitioning to working from home. And then there are places that are closed that normally play a role in transactions. So just to give an example, one of the most salient ones, it has to do with real estate transactions, both loans and conveyances. Normally, you would have a closing where somebody physically signed documents and those documents were physically notarized. That's kind of impossible if people can't come together for a closing. They recently passed the Secure Notarization Act, which allows people who are closing real estate transactions to go ahead and execute um, their documents. And this, of course, is not just for real estate. It would work for any other legal document, healthcare document, financial document. They could get a notary electronically in their own home. And so that's a good development for a situation where people cannot gather in physical proximity to one another. A little bit harder to solve is the problem of recording offices being closed throughout the country. Normally, when you have a real estate transaction, you want to immediately record the mortgage or the deed, or both. But if the recording office is closed, you can't do that. And so right now, the industry is kind of in flux, trying to figure out how they can get past this. There's this logistical problem, and maybe could they possibly do recording in a different way if their offices are closed? It's something that's generating a lot of discussion, but of course that also increases uncertainty and risk, which ends up being a disincentive to having these market transactions. So all of this is what's driving these companies to decrease their activity. It's driving stocks down. It's making people's ability to generate wealth really limited in this environment. Now, some have claimed that, wow, when they ordered a shutdown, they took away a lot of my economic value. This should be a takings. It should be unconstitutional under the 5th and 14th Amendment. Basically, it's a regulatory takings is the claim that the government seized my value against my will and they have to pay me just compensation. There's a fairly clear exception to a regulatory takings claim, or any takings claim, or regulatory, that basically that actions that temporarily destroy property values, that don't actually take title but destroy the value in the name of public safety or health that are required, that's not considered a takings. That's considered a valid government police power exercise. And the Supreme Court's held that for, 100 years now. That, for example, if they blow up a house to contain an out of control conflagration, a fire, that is seen as legitimate police power and isn't a taking, and therefore doesn't need to be compensated. So we have a lot of interesting business impacts. We have a lot of interesting individual impacts economically, and some responses starting and probably will be continuing to happen through the government. And there's a political aspect to this too. As people become economically more and more strained, there's going to be some pushback. And that's in addition to however they feel about the exposure that they have to the virus itself.